second grade, I'm going to go ahead and I wanted to share my screen with you to show you our read aloud for today. Let's see if that works. Okay, hopefully that is sufficient. So I'm going to go on to full screen. All right, so we have been learning about fairy tales, and now we're going to move on from fairy tales to tall tales. You'll remember yesterday we finished our Beauty and the Beast read aloud, and our next read aloud is going to be a tall tale. All tall tales are a type of folk tale. Tall tales, like other folk tales, were first told orally many years ago, and then they were later written down. Tall tales are oftentimes pretty funny stories about real life heroes of the American frontier during the 1800s. You should remember the American frontier and unexplored area of the American West from the Frontier Explorers domain last year. Let's see, tall tales that you guys are about to hear are often about the men and women who moved from the East Coast of the United States to the American West and helped tame the land or make it more livable for others. Logging was one way that many men and women thought they could make the land in the American frontier more livable. Logging is the process of cutting down trees and turning them into building materials. So like lumberjacks or loggers cut down trees as lumber or logs that are made into boards used for building. The main character in today's tall tale, which is called Paul Bunyan, was a famous lumberjack or logger. What do you guys see in this illustration? Paul Bunyan is a fictional character, and much of what you hear about him in today's read aloud will be an exaggeration. An important characteristic of all tall tales is exaggeration. The word exaggeration is an overstatement of the truth. An exaggeration in a tall tale makes the main character seem larger than life. He or she is always bigger or stronger or smarter or faster than real people. Some examples of exaggeration might be someone catching a really small fish, and then every time they tell the story about it, the fish gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Or like if your parents or grown-ups at home ask you to clean up your room and you say something like, this is going to take how long? Forever. That's an example of an exaggeration. Your purpose for listening today, I want you guys to listen carefully for examples of exaggeration in this tale about Paul Bunyan, who's a natural-born logger who moved to the American frontier from Maine. Okay, so here's our first slide. You can see Paul Bunyan, who was a giant baby. And instead of a crib, he's sleeping in a carriage, in a wagon. That's crazy. Even as a baby, Paul Bunyan was mighty big. How big? Well, he was so big that his parents had to use a covered wagon for his cradle. Did Paul Bunyan really sleep in a covered wagon as a baby, or do you think that might be an exaggeration? As you might imagine, young Paul Bunyan had a big appetite. He gobbled up 5 barrels of porridge a day, and his parents had to milk 4 dozen cows every morning and evening just to keep his baby bottle filled. Do you think that he really ate 5 barrels of porridge a day? Or that his parents milked 4 dozen cows to keep his bottle full? Do you think those might be exaggerations? Do you? It does sound a little out of this world. Paul was so big, it caused some problems in the little town in Maine where he grew up. When he sneezed, he blew the birds from Maine to California. Go play, please. When he snored, the neighbors ran out of their house hollering, "Earthquake!" After that, Paul's father thought that it might be better if he didn't sleep in town. He built a cot on a large raft for Paul and floated it off the coast. He slept on the raft for a few nights, but the floating cot did not work out. When Paul turned over in his sleep, he created giant waves that knocked down houses along the coast. Would parents really put their babies on a log raft and have them sleep in the ocean? Is that another exaggeration? Eventually, Paul's father decided that the East Coast was just too small for Paul Bunyan. The only sensible thing to do was to move out west. So the Bunyan family moved to Minnesota. In those days, Minnesota was just full of logging camps, sawmills, and lumberjacks. Americans were moving west and building the country. They had to cut down a lot of trees to make their homes, not to mention their schools or churches, boat, and furniture. When he grew up, Paul Bunyan went to work as a lumberjack, and what a lumberjack he proved to be. He made himself a giant axe with a handle carved out of a full-grown hickory tree. He could bring down a giant tree with a single swing of his axe. Could a man really make an axe with a tree and chop down another giant tree with one swing of his axe, or is that another exaggeration? As the tree tipped over, he would yell, "Timber!" So the other lumberjacks had time to get out of the way. Everyone looked up to Paul Bunyan, way up. The other lumberjacks were full of admiration for him. The bosses were grateful for the amazing amount of work he could do in one day. Paul had a big heart too, but one thing he always wished for was a true friend. There simply wasn't anyone else his size who could be his friend. All that changed during the winter of the big blue snow. It was called the winter of the big blue snow because it was so cold that everyone shivered and turned blue. Even the snow shivered and turned blue. Do you think snow really shivered and turned blue? It's probably another exaggeration. One day, as Paul made his way through the blue snowdrifts, he heard a muffled whimper. If a whimper was muffled, he probably couldn't hear it very well, right? He carefully followed the noise until he saw two big blue furry things sticking up out of the snow. He reached down and gave it a pull. What do you think was in the snow? Oh my gosh, you guys. It turned out that the two big blue furry things were two big blue ears. And connected to the big blue ears was a giant blue baby ox. Paul exclaimed, "This poor little fellow is half frozen." Paul carried home the blue ox, wrapped him in blankets, and fed him. The baby ox was so content that he took a long nap in Paul's big, strong arms. When he woke up, he looked up at Paul, and do you know what he said? "Mama, Mama." Then he gave Paul a big, sloppy lick on the face. Paul laughed and said, "We're going to be great friends, Babe." And they were. In fact, Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox were soon inseparable. Inseparable means that they did everything together. Everywhere Paul went, Babe went too. The two of them worked together in the lumber camps. Paul chopped down the trees. Babe hauled them to a river and dropped them in so they could float downstream to the sawmill. Together, Paul and Babe did the work of 100 men. Do you think they could really do the work of 100 men? Is this another exaggeration? The lumber company figured the very best way to keep Paul Bunyan happy was through his stomach, so they hired a special cook to feed Paul and Babe. The cook's name was Sourdough Sam. Sourdough Sam was known for the giant flapjacks, or pancakes, he cooked on the world's biggest frying pan, the colossal pan that sat on an enormous cast iron frame. Every morning, Sourdough Sam would build a raging forest fire underneath the pan. Then he would call for his two helpers, Lars Larsen and Pete Peterson. Lars and Pete would grease up the pan by tying slabs of bacon to their feet and skating back and forth across the sizzling pan. Then Sourdough Sam would make a giant stack of pancakes for Paul and an even larger stack of pancakes for Babe. Thanks to Sourdough Sam and his overgrown flapjacks, Babe eventually grew to be even bigger than Paul. He was so big that if you were standing at his front legs, you had to use a telescope to see all the way to his back legs. In fact, he was so heavy that his footprints filled up with water and turned into lakes. Babe making lakes with his footprints is another example of what? Exaggeration. In fact, there are more than 10,000 lakes in Minnesota today, and most of them were created by Babe the Blue Ox back in the frontier days. Babe and Paul helped the lumberjacks solve all sorts of problems. Once there was a river that was full of twists and turns. Sometimes the trees would get stuck in the turns and never make it downstream to the sawmill. But Paul Bunyan thought of a way to fix that. He went onto one end of the river and sent Babe to the other end. Paul grabbed his side of the river and pulled it in one direction, and he had Babe pull in the opposite direction. Then, snap, just like that, all the kinks were pulled out, and the river was as straight as an axe handle. Paul and Babe straightening a river is another example of what? Exaggeration, guys. Of course, this tightening operation left the river a good deal longer than it had before, and there was a lot of extra water lying around. Paul and Babe worked together to dig 5 big holes to hold all the extra water. Nowadays, these are called the Great Lakes. One day, the logging bosses got to talking. One of them said that the United States was a fine country to be sure, but it could still stand for a little improvement. For one thing, it could use more rivers. And what it really needed was one big giant river running down the middle of the country all the way from Minnesota down to New Orleans. If we ever had a river like that, the man said, we could ship timber down to New Orleans and all around the world. Well, Paul Bunyan happened to overhear this conversation. He told the bosses that he would see what he could do. So he hitched up Babe and they started plowing south. As they plowed, they threw a great mound of dirt and rocks to the right and a smaller mound to the left. On the right side, they made the Rocky Mountains, and on the left side, they made the Appalachian Mountains. Paul Bunyan and Babe didn't stop until they had plowed a channel all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. And that river that flows in the channel nowadays is what we call the Mississippi River. From that day on, Paul and Babe went around the country using their size and their strength to help anyone who needed it. Later, they dug the Grand Canyon. That should sound familiar, as they made their way to the west coast of California. And when the wind blows just right from the west, you can still smell those infamous colossal pancakes cooking on the frontier. Nice job listening, second grade. These are some questions that I want you guys to answer together, okay? Who is the main character and legendary person of this tall tale? What do you think? Next, I want you guys to unmute your microphones once the teacher has called on you and take some time discussing all the different exaggerations that you guys heard in this story.